The Dark Angels fight a planet-sized Lovecraftian beast, the Black Gate, which is the place that drew fools and treasure hunters until an astropathic message is received saying the gate is opened, and it was there the First Legion found a vast rift in the fabric of space. It was a wound, and coming through the mass was a writhing pseudopod. A nearby planet had been ensnared by its mass and was acting as an anchor. This planet could be used to drag the whole of its foulness into this realm of existence. The First Legion's ships engaged, removing chunks from the vast creature, and sent attack craft to the surface of the anchor planet. Led by Grandmaster Thrain, the First Legion prepared to assault the towering spiked pseudopod that had been thrust into the planet's mantle, the furthest extension of that loathsome creature that sought to breach reality. But even as the gunships began their landing approach, they fell under renewed assault. Smaller creatures swarmed up around the vast tentacles, sickly coloured abominations of undulating flesh like the toothed and spiked manta rays of old Earth, and stooped upon the Sokar and anchor pattern stormbirds of the assault force, battering the craft as they attempted to navigate the writhing mass of tentacles that surrounded the drop zone, and spraying them with iridescent flames that melted even hardened ceramite armour. Worse yet was to come, the sudden and debilitating wave of hatred that screamed in the thoughts of every one of the Legiones Astartes, an assault not on their bodies but on their minds. Mere mortal soldiers would have been broken against such an onslaught, but the warriors of the First Legion were more resilient, and, rather than descending into madness, they struggled on through the haze of loathing that threatened to stop the hearts with its fervour. Of the 100 dropships in the first wave, a quarter did not make it to the surface intact, either swatted from the sky by vast clawed pseudopod, swarmed by the endless throng of impossible sky horrors, or spiralling out of control as their assault pilot's mind fractured under the psychic onslaught. The 4,000 survivors rallied on the surface under the leadership of Grandmaster Thrain and the direction of the warriors of the hosts of Iron and Bone, whose expertise in such warfare granted them the authority to lead their brothers. Reforming their ranks in mere moments, the First Legion formed 3 columns, each headed by a detachment of the host of Iron, and one or more super-heavy war engines dropped by the surviving Anher pattern transports, and each set against one of the key pseudopod that held the unnamed planet in the beast's grasp. Such a feat of tactical adaptation was the forte of the First Legion, made possible by the flexible system of hosts it employed and the veteran nature of its warriors, yet even such skilled warriors were not fully prepared for what was to come. As they advanced upon the towering pseudopod, now immense towers of bristle-studded flesh and cartilage that rose into the sky and beyond, the psychic barrage only intensified, and the warriors of the First Legion were soon reduced to a crawl, wading forward as though through a bitter and hateful storm. Crippled by the behemoth's psychic assault, the First Legion were beset by yet another foe, as hordes of twisted, gangrel creatures were disgorged from the vast tentacles, tearing themselves free of its flesh and throwing themselves at the Space Marines. Through the miasma of hate that shrouded their minds, the warriors of the First Legion fought back, and even beset by the foe, each column wrought a bloody ruin on his ranks. At their fore stood Thrain, his great axe reaping a toll of enemies as they pressed forward. But the sheer number of the enemy and the numbing waves of hatred began to exact a price on the assault. Despite mounting casualties, the first of the columns reached its target and began to shell the huge pseudopod before it, as the infantry struggled to hold back the horde of misshapen thralls that seethed about it. Yet even the sheer firepower of Fellblade and falchion tanks failed to dislodge the massive tentacle, its flesh rolling and knitting whole in the wake of each assault. With casualties mounting, the assault began to flounder. The westernmost column lost its heavy armour as a huge pseudopod smashed it apart, and those warriors to the east found themselves mired in a war of attrition they could ill afford, and had there been lesser warriors, would have been disintegrated in a bloody rout. What saved them was both the unflagging courage of Grandmaster Thrain and the presence of a number of initiates of one of the least renowned hosts of the First Legion. Gathered within the ranks of the central column were several dozen of the Host of Pentacles, whose training included the esoteric arts of the Psyker in those years before the advent of the Librarius program, and as the enemy threatened to overwhelm the First Legion, it was their presence that stemmed the tide. As the warriors of the Pentacles staved off the psychic storm, Hector Thrain led the gathered Space Marines through the encircling horde, using the impressive firepower of the surviving tanks to blast a path clear and link up with the embattled Eastern Column. Together, the survivors found shelter in ancient ruins, seizing a brief pause in the fighting to hold a hurried council of war. The war bombardment from orbit, seeing little hope in a renewed ground assault, yet the ships above had made little impact on the vast creature. Worse, the Revenant, one of the cruisers, had become entangled in the flailing tentacles in an attempt to support the ground assault with fire from its gun batteries. With little hope offered by more conventional tactics, Idric Kaibalos, master of the Host of Pentacles, proposed a daring plan, an assault not on the vast mass of the creature's body, but on its monstrous will. Reformed into a single wedge of men and vehicles, the warriors of the First Legion burst from their refuge, 2,000 strong and determined to avenge their losses. Despite this, the warriors of the First Legion fought as a unified force, each knowing his role despite the sudden shift in formation and tactics. At the fore, the brutal warriors of the Host of Bone matched the cruelty of the foe with their own savage assault, while on the flanks, the initiates of the Host of Fire struck into the mass of the enemy horde to disrupt its movement and annihilate its champions. Spread all along its lines were the warriors of the Host of Pentacles, struggling to hold back the psychic storm that threatened to stall this assault, as it had done the first. Step by step, the combined host moved forwards, over the corpses of its foes, shifting and reforming to meet each threat as it appeared, and to counter each new mutation of the enemy. As they advanced, the mind storm only grew in intensity, and the Pentacles pushed themselves to the limits of their minds and bodies in order to shield their brothers. The most powerful endured, but in those days, before the Librarius and its training, the weaker were ill prepared to take such a trial. Those who could not match the malice of the foe were broken by it. Some simply collapsed as their minds shattered, but others lost control and became a grave danger to those they had sought to protect, imploding in fierce bursts of etheric energy or sending wild torrents of power arcing through the ranks of their own brothers. In the depths of the Order of Bloody Shrouds, the first disciplinary corps of the First Legion moved to silence those that lost control with the mercy of their blades, and the force pressed on as best it could. After hours of ceaseless fighting, constantly pressed by the unending tide of warriors, battered by the writhing pseudopod that sought to bar their passage, and the malign storm that tore at their sanity, the ragged survivors reached their target. There, directly under the vast tear in the fabric of space, Hector Thrain and his warriors made their stand, forming a wall of blades around the surviving Pentacles, even as huge, new, monstrosities pressed forward and came towards them in an attempt to bring an end to their assault. There, blooded and beaten, Kaibalos, master of the Host of Pentacles, set his gambit into motion. He and the most powerful of his followers abandoned their attempts to shield their brothers and turned the full might of their will into an assault upon the vast beast that hung in the sky above. Every iota of their determination was focused into the attack, but it could only hurt, not slay the beast. However, that was not its intent. With a psychic roar that shook the mind of all present, the vast entity that lurked behind the tear in space finally drew its heart into real space, spurred into action by the painful thorn of Kaibalos' assault, as the bulbous mass of its core, studded with vast eyes and fanged maws, thrust into reality, the Revenant, still enmeshed in the writhing tendrils of the beast, detonated its reactor core. The resulting explosion tore the beast apart, its shattered remains crashing down upon the planet below, and its spawn collapsing with the death of their creator. The surviving warriors of the First Legion numbered little more than 800, surrounded by a sea of corpses, having exacted a high price for each of their own fallen. Kyblos and the few remaining pentacles sealed the breach in reality, straining their tormented minds in an effort that cost yet more lives among their ranks. The fighting had both proven the worth of battle psychers and also known was their value now, their potential, as well as the potential danger. Though victorious, the Pentacles would be disbanded in the months that followed. Grandmaster Thrain declared the unaimed system and the space around it forbidden, both so as to preserve the safety of the Imperium and as a solemn memorial to honour the fallen. Beacons placed in the surrounding systems declared it contaminated by a gene phage of surpassing potency, enough to ward off even the most greedy explorers, a claim supported by the wreckage of Zenith Station, whose ruins bear the taint of such a plague, though the cause of its destruction can be found on no record. And if you enjoyed this video on the Dark Angels, try this one.